Welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. Today's interview is with Andy Brennan. Andy is the owner and cider maker for Burr Cider, which is his homegrown, wild, natural cidery. To describe Andy in a few short sentences is extremely difficult. He's a guy who I had a ton of fun meeting on this podcast for the first time, and you can hear we have a lot in common in terms of the way we think and approach life and cider and winemaking. He's an enlightened guy who also wrote a fantastic book about making cider and really the art of making natural cider, the economics of it, the compromises and struggles to be true to your values when making a beverage like a natural, wild-grown cider, and what's involved in letting apple trees speak for themselves. It's an incredible book that was one of the best things I've read in a long time, and I highly recommend it. The name of the book is Uncultivated by Andy Brennan. I had such a fun time talking to Andy. I hope you enjoy this interview as much as I did. He's an incredible guy who I couldn't help but pick his brain about a lot of different topics. So there are many juicy tangents and lots of great explorations of really the philosophy behind natural cider making, natural wine making, and everything related to it. If there's one thing that I do hope you take away from this, if you are new to cider, it's the answer to why Andy is even on this podcast about organic wine. And that's because cider is appropriately a wine in the family of wines, not a beer. And if you've only had cider that's been marketed and sold like beer, you haven't had real cider. Real cider is something like a pet nat in its intent and origins, and champagne in its flavor quality and potential for sublime and life-changing even drinking experience. So hopefully this interview, if you're not already, will help you fall in love with cider. Enjoy. The sponsor for today's episode is Centralis Wine. That's Centralas Wine. You can learn more about Centralis at centraliswine.com, and full disclosure, Centralis is my winery. I started Centralis because I noticed a disconnect between the values that many wine drinkers have and the kinds of wine they choose to drink. I wanted to give those of you who love wine an option to buy wine that reflects your values. So Centralis is built on two pillars. The first is that Centralis wine will always be made with, at minimum, organically grown grapes. And the second is that we will always tell you every ingredient that was added during winemaking. Our first vintage will be released very soon. In fact, it may be available by the time you hear this. And it's pretty limited, so if you want to get some, please go to our website, centraliswine.com, and sign up for our wine list. Or go ahead and buy wine. That's Centralas wine.com. We're also on Instagram at Centralis Wine, and I can't wait to share our wines with you. Andy, thanks for doing this. First of all, I really appreciate you joining in, and I want to say I read your book, and I just want to thank you for that. It was, one of my favorite reading experiences in a long time. And congratulations, but really thank you for putting that out there in the world.
Well, thank you. That's nice to hear. I felt like I'm not a writer, so I have that extra insecurities about the book that a non-writer ought to have.
Yeah. It's funny. I've been writing creatively and in blogs about wine and just in general. I live in LA, so of course I've written a few screenplays, and I'd say you're a writer, man. I was jealous of your prose for sure while reading it. It was juicy. It was easy reading.
Right.
Maybe it helps that I completely agree with pretty much everything you say. So there's that, it's always makes of course, I think you're a genius because I agree with you. uh, but I just wanted to jump right in with a question for you. I mean, I like to really talk about big ideas on this podcast more than just like how. I mean, I like to talk about everything. So, but I like to dig into big ideas. So feel free to let loose if anything comes up that you want to tangent on. But since this is the organic wine podcast, I want to start by just asking if you think cider fits either of those words, organic or wine.
Well, to me, there's really no difference between cider and wine. I make wine, I grow grapes, and the only difference, of course, are the particularities of the fruit. The devil's in the details there. So yeah,
Right.
on that level, on the cider and wine are different, but on the macro level, they are one and the same. And The word organic, I have uh, like a weird relation to.
Yeah.
Because it's and same with the word natural. It's tend to be a
Yeah.
marketing terms that couldn't be further from my particular use of the words organic and natural. So I mean I understand what other people mean. Or particularly what when somebody's marketing a product as organic or natural, generally means something very, very different than what I am talking about. Um,
Yeah.
I could go into that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely.
um, well, so organic as it is certified, and in terms of the marketing is, in my understanding of it, in my or not just understanding. I mean, I'm an agriculturalist. It's they are both organic is a form of conventional agriculture. It happens to be the best possible form of conventional agriculture, but it is conventional agriculture and farming are as unnatural as can be. Assuming, well, this gets into crazy philosophy here, but like if you're
Yeah.
it depends on whether or not you believe, humans to be, everything we do, and humans are part of the natural world. We are animals, so whether or not whether you accept human action and as natural as that's for a deeper discussion. But long story short, you could say that anything a human does is natural, including spraying Roundup and genetically modifying food. That's in that
Right.
sense, because humans are part of nature. What humans do are natural. I happen to disagree, or at least maybe disagree. I'll use that word. It's that that is natural. Um, Myself, I almost feel like I'm an alien. An alien. So anything that I do is unnatural. My tendency is to do something human versus natural, and lo and behold, it's because I'm a human. But um, my version of natural or organic is something in which a human steps back and sort of lets nature take the reins of how something progresses. Um, and that is truly the opposite of agriculture, of farming. There's not a single farm in the world where you just let things happen. It's not our instinct to do so. Um, we have a desire, we have an expectation, we toil with things to get that expectation realized, and what I just described is the definition of cultivation. So that's cultivation is not natural in my sort of exaggerated dichotomy way of looking at things. It's not the organic way in which, well, actually, I should say organic is in some ways a compromise there. So organic is a way of sort of cultivating things while realizing that nature will have its own desires and expectations, and it will realize something that we are not. Something opposed to what we are trying to achieve. Organic is not a term I use much, but I understand it to be a sort of compromise between extreme cultivation and extreme natural, and we're going to have to end up. I mean, we have to find something in between, and my particular philosophy as a grower is to lean heavily on the natural side.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if that. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Okay. Well, okay. So I'm going to jump back to something you said that I thought I just resonated as like the best way of putting it that I've never heard before, which is organic is the best form of conventional agriculture. I think that's a novel way of looking at it, and I think especially when you see the potential for, to use your term, uncultivated growth of these things that we consume. That is a really good way to look at it when you see how big the spectrum is. I guess that a lot of people think organic is one end of the spectrum, is another way to think of it, but it's really somewhere in the middle, or it's part of that spectrum. At least it's definitely not the end.
Yeah, it couldn't be further from. I mean,
the end, the opposite end of the spectrum, right?
Yeah, it's frustrating to me, when I'm selling cider or something that's, and they ask, is it organic? And I don't, I'm like, this is wild. And they're like, yeah, but is it organic? I'm like, well, okay, so I didn't spray it, and nobody has done anything to amend the soil. So there's no like fertilizer inputs. There's no,
Right.
herbicide, insecticide. Nobody's putting a fence around it so that the deer and the rabbits can't get to it. I mean, it's like so far beyond organic that it's
it's like, is a national park organic?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's and there's you can't at a farmer's market in 10 seconds explain how their view of the term organic is incorrect.
Right.
But it's I mean, when I buy food, I buy organic, so it's not like I'm not
Right.
I'm not opposed to it. I'm just saying it's not natural. You can't get, there's not a single organic farm that looks the way that farm looked 500 years ago when when it was wild.
Right.
It was massive amounts of manipulation go into organic agriculture, and it's which is so. Like I say, agriculture is it's not conventional agriculture is what I would use as the term would describe as like the most sprayed, most toxic form of agriculture. So I don't want to lump organic in with that.
Yeah.
But I do want to lump organic in with agriculture, which, like conventional agriculture, is extremely unnatural.
Yeah. That's probably a better way to put that. Yeah. And it's funny you're talking about manipulation. I want to say, do you feel like manipulation is a bad thing? I mean, and I mean, I guess I could approach that from two things. I know you try to get away from it as much as possible, but like, for example, with, uh, I mean, I don't want to take us too much away from the cider topic, but as I've learned, I have a little front yard vineyard here in Los Angeles that I call my experimental vineyard. And I started by planting vines and thinking like I'll be organic, and that means I'm not going to do anything to it. Like basically let it be a wild vineyard other than like tying up what grows so that they don't, shade each other too much. So already I was manipulating a little bit. But even then I got lazy and they just sort of did whatever they wanted. And I quickly realized by like I was able to harvest grapes the third year, which is pretty much how long you have to wait for vines. And then the fourth year, they just they were diseased and dead. Like I had to rip them out, and I basically realized doing nothing when you're being organic is that's not what organic viticulture at least is about. It's actually like heavily manipulated. You have to not only use like sulfur sprays to prevent, these are like prophylactics basically. There's nothing that kills in the organic thing, but there are a lot of prophylactic things for mildews, like so
Mhm.
sulfur. And then you also have to train the canopy in a certain way and pull leaves and pull shoots so that you get airflow and light in. And so, I mean, I just found myself basically, because I do like a morning walk every day. I go out and pass through the vineyard and just be like, oh, there's a leaf I should pull and there's a cane I should tie up. Every day I was doing something in it. And I've replanted since, and it's been 3 years since, and I just harvested the first thing. And the vines look super healthy, no disease or mildew on them, but it took basically daily manipulation. And
Mhm.
so I give that as one side of things where it's like, obviously this resulted in healthy grapes that were grown without any chemical fertilizers or sprays other than sulfur, which is organically allowed, but highly manipulated. And so I don't know, throw that back at you as like that question of, is manipulation a bad
um,
thing? what I,
it's funny. There's a very fine line between manipulation and persuasion.
and maybe, and here's another thought. I mean, I know wine, your forte is cider, not that you don't know anything about wine, but a question that I wanted to get into is, can you envision a way that what your vision for cider and the wild and uncultivated apple trees is, can you envision a way for that to happen with grapevines and wine? So maybe there's, I don't know,
Well,
take
I mean,
whatever part of those questions applies or you want to jump into, but
yeah. I mean, there are wild grapes growing right out my window here, but um,
yes,
I think
yeah.
yeah. I mean, where
Have you
I am
played?
happens to be a fortunate climate, terrain, and history for wild apples, which
Yeah.
which aren't native. I mean, in that sense, they're not truly natural. It's the word feral is actually better than wild.
Mm,
Uh, but um, for grapes would be difficult, but certainly the partnership with trees um, helped tremendously. And in my case, the side of the house and getting them up and to where they're not like in where I'm at the bottom of a valley, so fogs are common, and fungal diseases are particularly bad in my area.
yeah.
So yeah, having elevation helps these grapes produce, and it's just like the apples. It seems that the wild ones are uh, they'll take years off, and that is not only frustrating if you're making a living off of it. It's it can destroy you if waiting for the year that they produce. So it's this is again part of my my extremist philosophy, saying that the human expectation is counter to the natural progression of things. That um, it's our need to survive financially is puts a particular pressure on the plant and the seasons and um, the soils, and it's so yeah. I wouldn't. Um, I don't want to sound like a downer, but yeah, I wouldn't say that our expectations are truly natural,
Yeah.
or natural. I think they tend to be counter to the way natural nature would proceed, and when you think of nature that way, you're like, well, good. I mean, fuck it. It's nature's an asshole. It wants to kill us. And so, I mean, you depending on how extreme you are, you can be like, well, nature wants to kill me, or it's not providing for me, so I've got to do these things. And yeah, therein lies, I think, the middle ground. And I just happen to embody or live in an area in which doing nothing happens to work. I can't make wine, but I can make cider, and on not a yearly basis either. By the way, it's about every other year. Uh,
Right.
that's so. I got lucky, or I should say, I am lucky that nature is providing a way for me to survive um, in this financial man-made world. And then so I say man-made because there's all these these things that don't exist in nature that we created. So obviously, an economy is such a thing. I mean, even positive things like language. I mean, we've created these things. Um, so that's I think is what I'm trying to say about there's man-made things and natural-made things, and
Right.
yeah. Anyway,
No, I get that. Have you ever played around with those wild grapes? In
yeah,
terms.
they're not delicious. They,
Yeah.
and the sugars are particularly low.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I do use them in I actually have a blend of just whatever forage fruits I can find. I don't sell it, but I make it. It includes, like we have. Um, that's our base, by the way. The wild grapes. It's the juiciest of them, but we have other fruits that I just like to smash them all together. Like there's chokeberry. There's which is aronia. There's elderberry, blackberry, huckleberry. Anyway, I don't make
Yeah.
individual wines out of each of those. I I I just make one. Um,
Sort of like an upstate New York Pruno.
yeah, yeah.
I
Attica.
love
Yeah.
it. I love it. Um, yeah, I mean, I I think I mean, I understand your vision. I mean, I clearly there are, we both know the economic reasons that people haven't embarked on that, but I do feel like it has to do with the youth of our. Well, I don't know. I mean, obviously there were cultures that predated the Western cultures, but you think about the wine cultures of Europe go back thousands of years, and during that time they took the wild grapes, and replanted them from seed until they, because it's just like with apples, grapes create a whole new species or type of grape when you plant from seed.
Mhm.
And I mean, I imagine, obviously I don't have any uh, research to back this up. I'm sure it's out there, but I imagine humans were basically doing their own form of natural selection with grapes for thousands of years before they ended up with Pinot Noir and Cabernet and things that worked beautifully, tasted amazing, and worked in that environment that they were in. Sort of the indigenous grapes that tasted the best, basically,
Mhm.
over trial and error over years. I just feel like that's something that could happen. I don't know if it ever will happen in the U.S., but it's funny. I'm just thinking of
It's
an
almost
interview.
like a reverse evolution. if that were to happen, right? Where you just sort of you take your hands off the wheel and sort of rather than it's what you like a cultivated natural selection, like we're picking certain grapes to be the parents, and then over thousands of years we end up with those particular varieties. But that would be interesting to sort of reverse that with grapes, and we would obviously have to be paying very good attention to what successes. Well, actually, if you really just let nature do it, it would be like the successes were the ended up becoming the parents. So, and then they had wild kids, and then of those, the ones that grew up got to be the parents. And so,
Yeah, sort of what you're doing in the orchard, where you're spreading it out and sort of letting natural selection happen in on your property there. I'm assuming that's.
yeah. I mean, and I just want to repeat that I happen to be very lucky to have um, to be in an area where the apples have been doing that. And that the point of my book was to sort of speak for the process of letting the tree express itself rather than cultivate. Thus the title Uncultivation.
Right.
But what I was finding, and we were talking about this earlier, is what I found is what was so interesting about this process of the apples going sort of backwards in evolution, if that's not really the correct way of saying it, but sort of evolving on their own instead of being guided by us. What was interesting is that I found that that form of uncultivation could happen in just about every aspect of our lives, because we are that's what we do is we cultivate our lives. So whatever lessons I was learning just from observing apples grow on their own, that lesson could be applied, for instance, to the cider making or wine making process. Uh, and that could be applied to the way you run your business and the way you cultivate relationships, or that that for instance, the easiest analogy would be, so the way the apple has acclimated to a particular area, it's it does so without the guidance of our manipulation. So it wouldn't make sense to then take those apples and ferment them conventionally with sulfites and filtration and temperature manipulation and all those. So for that, taking apples that were just grown in at their due to their own magic, it made sense for me to ferment, to change the way I ferment. I was because when I first started making cider and wine, it wasn't. I was coming from a beer. I first made beer, where the heat pasteurizes things, and then you pitch the yeast. And so I had this fear of wild yeast and this great desire or this reverence that everybody has for like sanitation and stainless steel. It's like, oh, it's stainless steel, it must be clean. And so I had that, and so I had to sort of basically follow the wild apple when it came to forming a new philosophy on fermentation. And again, I found that was a compatible cultivation to the way I ran my business, or at least originally I had these great expectations for my business, and then just sort of let things take a different course. So anyway, that was what the whole point of the book was. I think was trying to take like this little micro phenomena, which is the wonder of wild apples, and extrapolate on a macro scale. Perhaps too grandiose, but that's just the way I think.
No, I think it worked. I mean, from my perspective, I maybe it's because our minds work similar, yours and mine, but I don't know how you can. I mean, well, I'll just put it this way. A big part of the mission of this podcast and what I do with wine is connection and reconnecting people to each other and to the earth and to wine and cider as part of as an agricultural thing, and that it's important to know what's going on. Like I live in Los Angeles. A lot of the consumers for your products and my future wine will be in cities, and I think that's because of the populations are now in cities, and it's like we've lost that connection by not living out where you live and doing what you're doing to seeing how inextricable these products are from the way that they were grown and the way that they were created. And so I guess my point is that I don't know. I mean, it's very important for me to connect the micro with the macro, and I don't.
Mm-hmm.
It might just be because my mind works the same way as yours in that, but I think it worked in your book, and I will definitely plug the book for you for anybody listening, that it's definitely a great read, and those parts about the economic considerations that you went through and the processes that you went through are just as fascinating as your obvious passion for apple trees and observing their wild nature and growth processes. It's all, yeah, it really I think it all intertwines very, very well. At least it did for me.
Thanks.
I would you say there's a bit of path of least resistance in that uncultivation thing? Like, I've always sort of been like, when I was single, my friends would be talking about the kinds of like my guy friends would be talking about the kinds of women that they were into, and I'd be like, you know what, I like girls that like me. um, is there a little is there a little bit of that, like in terms of both business and apple quote unquote farming and making, that it's that path, just what presents itself is the one that you should follow, and then if that when that dead ends or cul-de-sacs, you just find the next path that leads away from that.
I really like that analogy. It's yeah, and wow, we really do think alike. um, it, um, with so I mean, for me, I get lost in my strategy if I don't constantly like just go back and think about apples and what my actual observations are, and because our theories and our dogmas or whatever are often just that or ungrounded. So when I'm like, for instance, when I was learning to grow apples, I was told, via the great pomologists, like you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, and that list goes on forever, and you have to worry about this, 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 and that list goes on forever.
Right.
And then it had gotten to the point where I just like, this is impossible. I can't possibly be an apple grower. I can't afford it. I don't have the right soil. But but lo and behold, there's just opened my eyes and there's apple trees. And it's just like, how is this possible that people are telling me one thing and it's not true. It's just not true. It's apple trees are doing fine here. So how is it that they are doing fine here? And so and again, it's just like, well, for me, it's like, stop messing with it and stop telling it what to do, and it will be fine. Well, like, another thing I was thinking about is just how I don't want to say humans are not natural. We are natural, but our expectations are just so different than what you actually get. And one of the great analogies or examples of this is just the way the apple tree reproduces, and this big apple tree out my window here, on a big year, it'll produce 10, almost 20 bushels sometimes. And each of those, that's 140 apples in a bushel. And each of those has five seeds. So 140 times five times 20, we're talking thousands of seeds. And they're all going out into the world in the hope that one or two apple trees will survive. And you just think how different that is from the way humans reproduce, where we
Yeah.
every 9 months we have one, maybe if we're lucky we have twins, but we have one baby, and we're just going to protect the fucking hell out of that. And that's what farming is. We're invested so deeply in our, in this case, trees or vines. We bought them. That's an investment. We spent the time, our time investment. We bought the land. We're paying taxes on the land. We're paying somebody, or we're paying ourselves sweat equity to get these things in the ground. I mean, it's a lot invested in just one vine, and that's just not what nature does. Nature just throws it all out there, and it's yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's our reproduction methods are just like a glaring example of how different our expectations are, and so it makes sense that farmers, even the most quote unquote natural or the organic farmers, are still heavily invested in uh, in something that is not natural to an apple or a vine.
Yeah. So are you saying then that we should all have at least a dozen kids and and hope that one or two make it to a reproductive age?
Well, I'm from an Irish family, and just like two generations ago, that was the strategy. um, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really great insight. I mean that must deeply inform our psychology in the way that we think about so many things, and that is such a great insight into just seeing that difference between us and nature. I think there's this great quote that I learned again, as part of a screenwriting background when you're telling stories, that all conflict arises from a violation of expectation. And you think of like man versus nature, and again, like that, why it's described as man versus nature, or human versus nature is much better way to put it. But again, like you've I think you've nailed it with just it's about our expectations. It's really that is very cool.
Well, I mean,
um
every farmer I know will call me on that, as and say it's just bullshit. I've heard so many times that like humans are part of nature. We're animals. We have our expectation is part of nature. So um, it's I
it-
I hear them. I know what they're saying. But you
would you
take
say
that
there's
to
a
an
spectrum?
I would say there's definitely a spectrum, but like I say, to one end of that spectrum, to an extreme, if you're going to concede that everything humans do is, and humans are part of nature, our expectations are part of nature, then why even bother growing organic? Why not just GMO and um, you know round up your crops? I mean, just you could if you're going to say that sort of um,
I think
you know,
you talk about this in your book, where you talk about the necessity of questioning where we are. I'm going to do disservice to how you put it, but essentially what I got out of it, grossly paraphrased, is the sense that it's imperative to, I guess, continue to evolve in our thinking about what is the best way to cultivate things. Like, that we need to constantly be questioning, and that for a long time, and I think, and this is something I want to get into about why maybe we see things changing now. But for a long time, we thought we had all the answers. I mean, we thought we had conquered nature, and now there's clearly a renaissance. At least I see a renaissance of rethinking that. And I would call it an organic renaissance, but like we've already talked about, it's bigger than that. Um, we our world is unhealthy. We're unhealthy, and we're beginning to realize a big part of that is the way that we've been thinking about our agriculture. And yeah, I think you've talked about, just how to, in your book at least, you definitely talk about that. I don't know, maybe you can say better what I'm trying to paraphrase, but just the reevaluating and keeping, and I guess like re-questioning our assumptions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to end up sounding very conservative, whereas my background is actually quite progressive. But um, I don't see that taking some measures to step back are a sustainable solution at this point. I think it has to be much, much more radical. And
Mm.
I mean, it could have been when our population was like a third of what it is now, but that we could have proceeded at a different pace. But now I just kind of feel like we're painted in a corner. I don't. I mean, I don't see it ending well. So yeah. I mean,
you know
that's just my yeah. I don't know, Malthusian way of looking at things, but uh,
I just
yeah.
no, I it's funny. I had a sense that you might feel that way. And just by chance yesterday I was driving up to wine country, so it's a long drive from LA. It's a couple hours. So I'm listening to podcasts, and I'm listening to like a permaculture podcast. Right now I couldn't tell you the name. I'll look it up, and if you're interested I'll send you information about it. But um, basically, it it was a guy who has received, I don't know, maybe like a Nobel Prize even for his work and what he creates are ecological. He engineers biological systems to clean up toxic human waste and leaky landfills and stuff like that. And he's done it successfully. Like he's figured out ways to let nature clean itself, and he just engineers it basically. So he created, I don't know, very very impressive, very hope giving work that he's doing. Like he's going to the like one of the mottos of his school was do good things in bad places, or something like that. And he said, this is what I'm getting to, is he said, when he started teaching, he saw all these bright young minds of people who cared deeply, clearly, about the things that you and I are talking about right now, the same kind of things and the future of the world, and were sort of despairing because they didn't know what to do. And he realized his whole mission sort of shifted in that moment to giving them practical ways that they can actually make the world better, and that they, to give hope to his students. And he had so, I mean, he was very hopeful, and he seemed to know a lot more than I do about what the ills are, as well as what solutions we have to treat them. And it's funny, like, and this is not a plug for organic, because obviously we've already talked about the complications with that word, but his number one thing was what you can do practically, just anybody can do, is just buy organic food. Eat what you eat. Make sure you support that kind of agriculture.
Mhm.
um, and that's a big part of what I'm trying to do as well, is just promote that kind of practical step that can be done. But anyway, it was very hopeful, and I wanted to share it with you, and I've done a bad job of giving you any details that would be specifically hopeful, but I'll send you a link or something to that. He's a brilliant guy that I think everybody should know more about. And I was going to bring what you're talking about, like when we started talking about organic and where that is in the spectrum. A lot of what I'm learning about permaculture is sounds a lot closer to what you're talking about. Like if there's a word for it besides uncultivated, or natural, permaculture seems to definitely be solidly in your camp. And I'm just, the more like wine for me, as apples were for you, wine has been this sort of path that has led me to go deeper and dig deeper into these things that we're talking about now, and agriculture. And I'm finding myself now listening to podcasting, doing research about permaculture, and all this body of knowledge that's out there that really does harken back to what you're talking about, like finding the wild plants and fruits and edible things that grow naturally in your area and thrive naturally, giving them a space to do that and letting them do it basically. And I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that, other than to say, do you feel permaculture? Have you looked into permaculture as a
Well,
idea?
yeah,
And
I have a couple of good friends who are uh, part of a permaculture sort of activist group, and of course, most of the growers who um, I most sympathize with are would consider themselves permaculture, and they would say what I'm doing is a version of that as well.
yeah,
So I empathize with that term. Sympathize. I don't ever get those words right. But yeah, and like I said, the term organic is a little less specific than permaculture. Most people who are permaculturalists are philosophically they're already on board with the organic thing, but not vice versa. Um, for instance, if you're growing your garden via permaculture, you're not likely to use Lorsban or Malthion or as insecticides, where organic growers, though, as a whole, or particularly at the commercial level, are still growing pretty much in a monoculture. They're trying to maximize their
right.
whatever whatever acreage they are, and they're utilizing the economies of scale, which by that um, by that measure means reducing the amount of switching from crop to crop. It's why apples have gone from an infinite potential varieties to just having five varieties that you get in the store. It's because the farmer doesn't want to. Each tree is susceptible in different ways to the bacteria and the insects, and they grow differently, um, different vigor, um, different needs, different harvest times, different marketing. So if you reduce all of that, which essentially that's the philosophy of monocultures, you reduce all the variables so that you can maximize your acreage. That's um, yeah, that's I have to say most organic growers are still sort of in that camp. They're trying to maximize whatever
Right.
soil they happen to own, which again is one of the lessons of growing or just foraging is that you can't think of it's just not sustainable to think that your farm ends at that property line.
Right.
So it's I think and we're talking about artificial pressures, and that is one of those pressures. That's one of those great illustrations. Is that you've got 10 acres, you've got to maximize that 10 acres. Your property ends there, so it's just completely artificial. You look down on a satellite image, you're not going to see the line. Um, we've created that line. So anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, I think the philosophy of permaculture is to me more profound than the commercial use of the term organic for sure.
Right. Yeah, it's funny you bring that up. It's a good segue into something I wanted to talk about, which is so like we keep wild bees here in our backyard in Los Angeles, or from time to time we have, whenever they've decided to move in, we just put out hives. They move in from time to time, stay for a few years, maybe die, maybe move off or whatever. And when you understand how bees live and you get to observe them in close quarters like that, you get this really amazing visual of a superorganism,
Hmm.
and just how none of them really in any way is separable from, in the sense of their livelihoods, from the hive, and you can really physically observe this.
Yeah.
uh, but then one winter, I had this mind-blowing realization. I started noticing for the first time that like
Humans are doing that, right?
well, well, that too, and I, but I mean, even more keeping it with the bees for now is like I noticed that they would swarm. Of course, right? Of course, what you said, but I would notice the thing that I noticed with the bees is that they would swarm before a rainy season. So like we'd had this years of drought, and this like there just weren't that many swarms. You didn't see that many bees, but it was like when the rain came, the swarms came first. I mean, and when I realized, wait, they would have had to have been breeding the new queen, which they need, to reproduce to create the swarm to send off to create a new hive. They would have been needing to do that long before any, rain was even in long range forecasts, which meant that they somehow knew instinctively whether it was going to be a wet or a dry spring. And my realization was that they're actually part of the weather, that they are the weather.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
they're not a super organism in the sense of unto themselves as a hive. They're a super organism that encompasses all of nature and their environment, even out into the oceanic currents and weather patterns of thousands of miles away over the Pacific Ocean. And I was like, I had this like holy shit moment where it's
Yeah.
like, this is amazing. Like they're sensing, they know things that transcend even our technological abilities to know. Anyway, it makes me, I say all that because you bring up the idea in Uncultivated, and I'm paraphrasing, but cider as a superorganism, and of course you just mentioned that humans are similar in that we can't be separated from each other. And I'm going to quote now because I wrote this down. This is from Uncultivated. For cider to be whole, it must be alive, one with the life of the trees, the people, and the microorganisms. It's not a representation of these things; it is these things. And of course, I would agree with that, and I think it applies to wine as well. And I'm wondering if maybe you can talk about how you might seeing that apply to wine as in the same way that you see it as applied to cider,
It's
or talk about the concept in general, however you want to talk about it.
it's accessing some of these thoughts as I wrote them is impossible without considering what has happened in the meantime with the virus. And I think that and when you were talking about the bees, I can't stop thinking about um, how one we are, as our society. And I was one of those people early on when it was coming out, like a lot of people. Well, why does everybody have to be um, like shut their lives down? It's like that doesn't happen with the flu. The people who are sick, they stay at home, and the people who are susceptible, they protect themselves and quarantine themselves if possible. But the more I thought about it, it's just not. It's just not. We're. It's like we aren't that way. I don't think nature is that way. It's that sort of a monocultural way of looking at things that we are just all one. And I think for me, maybe I hope it's not a futile challenge to try to learn the wisdom of the way these apple trees are surviving on their own, but they're not on their own. That's what's so crazy about it. They're they're so independent. They're communicating with maple trees and pine trees, and they're communicating with other apple trees on the other side of the mountain. And the birds, literally the birds and the bees. I mean, they're all part of this. So for me, just tuning out expectation or what I think I know is the best chance I have of actually learning anything. If yeah, I should say I'm always wrong. Yeah.
Well,
That's a great phrase. The more I know, the more I know. I don't know. I don't even know the phrase. Maybe you know it. The less
I
I
think
know,
that's
or
a
something.
great way to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the way you said it is perfect because you didn't know the phrase about not knowing what you know. Um, that's funny. Yeah, I agree. I think that is good, and that's the funny thing about expertise, I guess, and the idea of experts in things, in anything really. I always love experts in religion. My degree's in religion, so I
Oh
always
yeah,
love the idea of an expert in religion. Like,
yeah,
I'm like, I mean, you can memorize the holy books, but I don't know how you get to be and you can know, I mean, you can know about the histories and, but to answer the questions of religion, nobody can be an expert in the things,
yeah,
It's like,
yeah.
anyway, I digress. But my experience with cider, I think I mentioned this to you when I first asked you to come on the podcast was and I think this is the big concept that I think when I talk about cider that I'm you helped solidify in your book, but I think just the easy entry for people is don't think about cider as beer. Don't associate it with beer. Associate it more with wine. And really, I would say, based on like my immediate impression, was like associate it with something like champagne,
Hmm.
where it's. I mean, I was sort of blown away. I was just like, I took my mom. We were going to. My sister lives in upstate New York. We were going to visit her, but I just did a little road trip with my mom so we could have some mother son time. This was just a couple years ago, and we drove up to the Finger Lakes up through Ithaca and did a little tour between Cayuga and Seneca Lakes, and stumbled upon a cidery there. And it was like, oh, and it's organic. And I was like, great, let's check it out. We were just stopping wherever we were going for wine, but we stopped at a creamery, and we were like, let's stop at the cidery, and went in, and I was like, wait a minute, like these are like wine bottles, and there are varieties, there's like species, like there's this northern spy, and there's like, and then they're doing them in a brute style, and I was tasting, I was just blown away. I was like, this is incredible. Like there is as much potential, if not more potential, to cider than wine in some ways, because of the sort of learning from you the infinite varieties that can come out from seeds and things like that, and can actually be ideal for cider. um and I mean, a lot of times I think now the East Coast should just stop its attempts to grow wine and just grow apples, which I think are much better acclimated to the East Coast. But um can you envision a future in which the Northeast is, cider from the Northeast becomes like Pinot Noir from Burgundy, or something to that equivalent, where it's just like people get it, like people finally are like, oh, this is like the finest expression of something that is perfectly situated to this terroir, to this place, and is so fine and so beautiful that can't be replicated anywhere else.
I can, I can look into the past and see the future that way. It's because
Yeah.
it's just 200 years ago. It was, I think, the people had that appreciation for the complexity of location and the complexity of variety that apples have that have genetically that potential for, and yeah, it was all destroyed by progress of agriculture. Those artificial pressures to get big, or is that that great phrase from the Secretary of Agriculture, "Get big or get out." Um, it is that
Bleak.
yeah, it's super bleak. Um, so I mean, it was there, and it was, when you look back at journals, you more often than not find it was just a sort of crude drink, and it was not particularly, 99% of it was just sort of like, the house wine made um, with people who have greater concerns than cider. Um, but there are those people, as there are in, this 1 out of 100 or 2 out of 100 or whatever the number is, that people approach things as an art are going to just get, crazy about it. And that with that genetic diversity 200 years ago, and that, and being that the entire population, so 100% of the population was basically drinking cider or making it themselves, that, just 2% is that was a substantial number. Probably like the people who are approaching cider now and sort of to some artistic standard, even though the population is maybe 1,000, not 1,000 times, but I don't know, maybe 100 times greater now, still doesn't equal the number of artisans making cider back then, just by virtue of the fact that cider drinkers today are it's like 1 out of 1,000 people or something like that. It's this minute thing. But wine, of course, has been given great attention, and so what's exciting, I think, for a lot of people is that cider hasn't been given that attention. I disagree pretty vehemently with the rest of the industry about sort of developing it in this to meet modern expectations. But even on that level, its potential is exciting, and that's why you saw so many people like the Boston Beer Company, that Sam Adams getting into cider, and Heineken, and all these people. They saw. Hopefully they're out now, but they saw this great.
Yeah, I think they've moved to
dollar
hard
sign.
seltzer.
Yeah, thank God. Yeah,
Just chasing the trends.
yeah, and their marketing was just so nauseating. I mean, it's yours. I like that. Yours. You are your friends. You are your company. And so when you see sort of nauseating, when you're seeing the thing you make being marketed in a sort of nauseating way, it's embarrassing. Yeah, just like please, don't give people the idea that's what cider is.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody takes anything away from this podcast, I would want them to know that, for a long time I was turned off by cider. I would just be like, somebody'd go to a bar and order a cider, and I'd be like, no, gross. Like, why would you order a cider? And now that I've had good cider, like I would drink it any day over just about anything, even wine sometimes, because I mean, when it's good, it's that good. And it's not a beer alternative. It is its own very special. I mean, it really is more like champagne. Like I just that experience of a complex, like the best champagne I've ever had is easily on par with a decent cider that I've had that was made that way.
Yeah, and just like you had mentioned, the Finger Lakes, that area. I don't know if they're doing this on purpose, but their ciders are particularly champagne-like. I think the
Yeah,
yeast
maybe
and the disgorgement, the cleanliness of the drink it's sort of regionally. It does put up a number of great ciders that are quite champagne-like. Yeah.
and I mean, and you can talk about how maybe yours is a little different, because I know it must be, and I don't want to say it's all going to be like this pristine uh, Grand Cru champagne experience in terms of clarity and the bubble texture and everything else. What should people expect in terms of a good cider that maybe you make?
Well, my ciders, I don't empath. I don't want to be like. I don't want to be uh, I don't want to be like in a champagne crowd, or like the sort of exclusive wine. I've always my my sympathies are always with like the hillbilly. So I kind of like, and when I first had my first great cider, it was it, I don't think it was West Virginia. It might have been from Pennsylvania, like the mountains, and it was. But it's um, some would say it's crude, but it's an acquired taste to have that sort of amount of yeast sediment and apple sediment
It's maybe
and
more equivalent to like a pet nat if people
oh,
are
for
in the
sure,
natural
yeah,
wine, right?
yeah.
And so you're getting a little haze, you're getting a little the yeast sediment because you're finishing the fermentation in bottle.
Hmm.
Um,
And you get that
and
texture, which is which that's to me that's one of the great crimes in the wine world. It's disgorging, but
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
it's but you got to do what you got to do when your customer expects it. To yeah,
Well, I, I mean, I'm assuming you've seen a change to some degree in customer expectation, especially if you're dealing with New York, because I mean, I know LA and New York are pretty much two epicenters for the natural wine movement, and I mean, there are multiple stores dedicated to wine that has sediment in them, now,
yeah,
and I'm assuming the same. You've seen that same transition in the past few years. Is that true?
yeah. That's been yeah. Just to be able to even talk about it is with like regular people at the farmers market is just that wasn't possible even maybe 2 or 3 years ago, much less 10 years ago. So it's yeah, it's been a great and surprisingly fast uh, learning process by the general public to sort of accept or at least to come to like a rudimentary idea of what natural wine is. And um, yeah, I mean, we're still got a long way to go, but it's
Yeah,
yeah, it's
yeah,
helpful.
yeah. Right. And now, can I ask you another question? I mean, basically, I just wanted to ask you about cider making. Do you need to go?
No, no, I have I actually I was you were talking house building earlier, and I just poured a cement slab, so I'm watching it cure now. Uh,
Nice.
yeah,
After having weathered the tropical storm, how'd that go?
yeah,
Any
I was. It went fine for us. We
Okay,
live on the side of the mountain, which means we don't get flooding unless it's coming down from above and passing us, but it doesn't sit on our property
got it.
like some people. And
It wasn't violent enough winds to blow down trees or
no,
anything.
there's a lot of power outages and trees down. And, we did get like 6 inches of rain, so it was
Oh wow,
a
yeah.
lot for to take in such a short period of time. But it's nothing like Hurricane Sandy or Irene or
Oh,
like a really bad one.
got it. Okay, cool. So I guess the final thing that I wanted to ask you about was so in cultivate uncultivated. You say you just use this as my entry to what I really want to ask you. You say cider should be led by the apple and its place of origin, not the microorganisms or the human hand. Um, and so what I want to ask you about is practically speaking. Let's say I found some apples here in Los Angeles that I wanted to make cider with.
Mhm.
How would I make cider the way that you make cider, like really in detail? But also, I mean, for making wine, I'll just throw this out there. I kind of want to understand. Well, and I know there's a difference between keeping the fizz in, which definitely adds a protective element to the cider or the wine. So with like a pet nat or a cider, finished in bottle, you get that CO2 protection. But are you literally adding no sulfites at any
No,
stage?
no, no, I wouldn't do that.
Never. Okay. None,
I
not
mean,
even
I
like a.
have in the past, and did like micro amounts to apples that I really wanted to use that had rot on them, and I could smell
Uh,
vinegar. But no,
yeah.
I didn't do it because it just like although I do have one cider that is not natural. It's farmed, so for that, I don't add sulfites, but they're sprayed on the plant. As
Right. Like
anyway,
sulfur.
yeah,
Yeah. That's
um,
like what I do too, like powdered sulfur or micronized sulfur or something. But
yeah.
I mean, what I've found with wine, because I've been drinking a lot of natural wines just to try to get a sense of what's out there. And even when I've asked for, and these are still wines, but even when I've asked, a person at the store who knows their selection, give me something that doesn't taste microbial. I want to taste the fruit, but make it a 0-0 wine, like make it a no
Yeah.
sulfite wine. Even then, like in the best case, there's a pretty high level of volatile acidity. Some sort of, acetobacter thing has happened. It's very
Yeah.
sour on the palate, like, and I'm not tasting something that I enjoy. I'm tasting, and I get there's an expectation thing that I need to get over,
Yeah.
but and maybe that's all it is. But I also feel like there's got to be something, I don't know. There's and maybe I don't know. I guess, like, how would you make, like,
Well,
to
I
me
think
though.
my ciders actually do taste clean compared to what you're describing.
Okay.
They're not they're not overwhelmingly bready or have that volatile acidity. Um,
Okay. So
I think,
you
yeah,
with
I
with
do.
the acid.
You have to do, I mean, like cultivating a relationship to the yeast is exactly like cultivating apple trees. You don't get fruit overnight. It's in order to get, I think, your farm producing in this sort of like beautiful whole way where the trees are thriving, the bees are thriving, the soil's thriving, the forest is thriving. I think that same philosophy goes to cultivating yeast and the environment in which your cider is fermenting. And I didn't start um, organically. I started with a lot of pitched lab yeast, and I
Yeah.
still use it like in one of our ciders. So it's definitely one of the components that are in the air in the microbial environment of my barn. But
Right. Right.
I save all the yeast from year to year, from batch to batch, and and I use those. I sort of taste through those at the beginning of the fermentation season, and I include that in the initial fermentation. So that's in the air as well. But then, of course, you've got the yeast on the apples, and um, I have no idea what yeast is actually fermenting the
Right.
cider, but um, in order to keep the taste clean, I think there you have to do several things. Obviously, cleaning the equipment for me is pretty important. That's I'm very vigilant about cleaning the pumps and the press and the barrels, but also you can't ferment um, in warm temperatures. It just for that I think is destroys the whatever biome is on the apples. It's like a hot fermentation is like I think it's akin to like boiling something on a stove. Yeah, you sort of
Yep.
cook
Like
out the
like
flavors.
pasteurization kind of thing.
Yeah, so I can't start fermenting until October around here, and it's done way too often where people are using sort of mid-season apples and fermenting in warm temperatures, or using the recommendations of the lab yeast, bringing the temperature up to like 70 degrees or something like that.
Hmm.
I think yeah, I think those are all detriments to the profile eventually. But for it's trial and error for me, like finding the exact right time to pick the apples and right time, which is to say as late as possible, but when to ferment as well. And I don't I'm not under a microscope looking at what uh,
Right.
yeasts are dominant, or it's all just by blind taste test which ones I like, and I've been sort of cultivating in that direction for a long enough period of time that I can say that year by year, I'm less nervous about the them going in a bad direction. I feel like I've got a good environment now, and I've got a good grasp of how to keep things clean enough to my liking. And that was your quote about, like, you don't let the bacterial note dominate. I think that's important. I don't
Yeah.
particularly admire or love. I've ciders that are funky
Yeah.
or
Yeah,
wines.
me either.
Yeah.
And so you're not doing any lab analysis at all?
No.
Okay. Just yeah, just got it. I mean, I feel like that's, especially if you're not adding sulfur, there's no reason to, really.
Yeah.
It's just go. But having said that, you gave some numbers in the book about, if I remember correctly, you said you're producing about 1,500 gallons a year, and of that, about 300 of it you're going to determine is unusable for cider because because something happened microbiologically in the course of it fermenting and aging, and it becomes vinegar or something else.
Yeah, or
That's like,
malolactic note is the most common thing. It becomes that buttery quality that happens in the spring becomes too dominant or something like that. Right now, I'm
okay.
holding on about 500 or 600 gallons of cider. That's just too tastes too much like butterscotch. So it's
So
yeah.
so based on that, I'm guessing when it's the way you want it to taste, it hasn't gone through a malolactic conversion like a lot of wine is allowed to go through to just to have that stability. You're somehow, there's still malic acid in your bottled cider.
Yeah, definitely. That's which
Okay.
it makes our ciders. I like that bright quality.
Yeah.
Bright.
And there's, how are you preventing it from converting?
I don't know. I have no idea. Um,
That's amazing.
yeah,
I mean, it just, yeah, like, because
I
it
know
is,
a winemaker who adds like some enzyme which converts. It'll eat the malic acid, so that like you tell me if I got this right. There's some enzyme or yeast that you add in the beginning of the fermentation, which eats the malic acid in the grape. Well, I don't even think there's much malic acid in the grape, but it'll it'll eat that particular acid so that it won't convert to a lactic acid later. Um,
Oh, that's interesting. I
yeah.
haven't heard that, but because I mean, only, the only thing that I know is just like natural yeast, native yeasts are on the grape skins. The bacteria that eats the malic acid and converts it to lactic acid are ambient as well. And so, if you're trying to make a natural wine, you pretty much have to allow it to go through malic acid, malolactic conversion, they call it, or at some point it's going to happen in the bottle and you're going to get weird, you're going to get some funk because it's going to be producing, CO2. You're going to get spritz, if
Mhm.
you're trying to make a still wine and it hasn't gone through that, you're going to get a sparkling wine, whether you want to or not,
Yeah.
or at least a spritzy wine. And my guess is that apples just have a shitload of malic acid, so that even if some of that happens, it's such an acidic environment that the bacteria can't do it all. They can't convert it all. That would be my guess.
Yeah,
But I
it's my guess too. But I have zero interest in actually learning, and though it might help me tremendously, I still don't care because it's just like just it seems like
it's working,
I'm
right?
trying to
So
do it as natural as possible. So,
right.
but yeah, no, it's there's like uh, a fifth or I don't know how much that is. A little more than a tenth of the cider I withhold, at least because it doesn't match also my aesthetic standards. And it's not just a malolactic. Maybe it is that I get some. There was one cider a couple years ago that it was too farmy, which a lot of people loved, but I didn't. So I was like, I'm not selling it anymore, and I just I pulled it and I I drank those myself. I just,
Mhm.
you're as an artist, you kind of want to, you have you want to you you want sort of control of to of you want I don't know. Yeah, it's almost like a performance. You want things to go well. You don't want it. Anyway, I have a vision for. Um,
Yeah, you want to be true to your vision is probably, I guess.
yeah,
Is that what you're trying to say?
yeah. Oh, this was the very first thing I said earlier is that there's this fine line between manipulation and persuasion.
Right, right.
um, but yeah, they're really the same thing, I think. But um, I just
So,
want, I don't want to put something forward that doesn't taste like what I know those apples taste like, fermented. And if it's too buttery, then I say, like, that's not, you're not tasting the apple, you're tasting this particular uh, enzyme or yeast, or, for sure, if it's Brett. Bread, I luckily I ever get, but there's this one farm note that a lot of British ciders have, but it has this sort of briny, like almost like you're eating a gherkin or something. Um, and
mm,
sometimes my ciders get those, and I just feel like I like it. I really like that cider, and yet nonetheless, I'm not going to sell it because it's just, to me, it's not the accurate. Uh, Picture of what I know where those apples are growing. I don't know if that makes any sense.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel the same way. I guess that's my biggest complaint and concern about natural wine is that I feel like to the extent that we tolerate what I would consider these dominant notes to be what we think of as natural wine, I don't think it's sustainable because I think at some point we get tired of that because there's a sameness to that. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's like I know what Brett tastes like. I know what vinegar tastes like. I know what hydrogen sulfide smells like, and none of those things are the things that I go to wine or cider for. And if that is what we think it is because we're making it in a natural way, I feel like the bar is too low. I think we need to, you know, I think we need to be able to taste the fruit and
Mm-hmm.
the land, the terroir, the location,
Yeah.
and not those other things. I mean, not that you can't taste them, but that they need to be in balance with those other things. If they're part of the terroir, if it's part of that area naturally for whatever reason, I get it. But it can't be the only thing that you're tasting. And I guess I'd love to see us heading in that direction with the natural beverage movement that people get raise the bar a little bit in terms of what they'll tolerate and get a little better educated about those things so that they don't think like that is what natural wine is. Like I think natural wine could be much better than that, and natural cider is, you're probably setting the bar for what it should be.
Yeah,
And
I think there's a lot of room for the for people who really want to experiment with uh, different yeasts, and that those the the flavor profiles of those biological elements. There's a lot of room. It's not what I'm going for. I mean, obviously,
yeah,
there's three species here. There's humans, there's bacteria, and there's the apple tree or in grape vine.
yeah,
But yeah, there's three species, and you could try to have each of those equally represented, so that none of them are dominant, or you could let uh, sort of the human dominate, like one would, I think. To me, champagne, as it's is a is can be
the traditional.
overly, yeah,
Yeah,
it's like a little bit too
absolutely.
much human, and it's like
Yeah,
I taste someone's hand a little too much.
it is definitely a lot of it made in a laboratory for
Yeah,
sure.
the
Yeah,
the yeast, the disgorgement,
yeah.
the
The
way that grapes are
dosage.
grown.
Yeah,
Yeah. Um,
yeah.
So I don't want to taste the human hand, um, um, and I really don't want to taste the bacterial element, because to me the wonder of these apples that I'm foraging is just it's like paradise. Just seeing these trees, it's philosophically, just even thinking about how they got to where they are and how they continue to live and what they contribute. I mean, it's just such an absolute miracle that that's so in my aesthetic. That's how I want that to be what people are drinking. That's I it's impossible, but I would love for them to um, see these things in the bottle, I guess.
Hmm. It's it's funny, like all reading your book and sort of my own romance with cider began in a way. I'm from small town Pennsylvania in South Central Pennsylvania, and it's apple country, really. Like, it's the
Hmm.
Appalachians. I grew up like a couple miles from the Appalachian Trail, and it's like rolling mountains, Appalachian mountains, with these clearings of orchards,
Yeah, that's
on
where
on the
I.
hill.
Yes, I said my yeah. You're in Hagerstown, Maryland, by the way.
Yeah, yeah.
Because
So
that's where I said my first word, is where my first experience with apples was, that exact
that's yeah,
region.
I'm like 30 minutes north of Hagerstown is where I grew up,
Yeah.
basically. And when I go home, because my parents still live there, basically what we do for activities is go get lost on country roads, and
Hmm.
we'll just find ourselves in the middle of nowhere, having like come off some dirt road that's actually like a state road,
Hmm.
and we'll be in an orchard. Like, clearly it's a state road, but nobody uses it other than the farmers who live right there. Like, we just drove between their barn and their house and it felt like a driveway, but there was like a stop sign and a road sign. And uh and it, it's magical. I mean, it is one of my favorite things in life to do, is to be out there amongst that, in those orchards. And those are cultivated orchards. Those aren't even the wonder that you're talking about, of seeing what can happen when they go back to nature, or when they move around and start planting themselves naturally. And it's still amazing. And we're just constantly stopping and finding like fallen apple. Like, it's usually after the pick, like late fall or something, just picking up these sort of mealy apples, but they're still the best apples that I've ever had in my life.
Hmm.
I mean, at least for a long time, because in California, we get whatever has been refrigerated in Washington over the winter or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm leading to a question here, not just tangenting, but I think this, I can make this the last question. If you want to, how do we convey that? Or, and I would say this about wine, and I think there is sort of an amazing thing with wine that can happen when you experience it that way as well. How do you, and just the broader question of how do you translate that to the customer, to the consumer, who has the power to really change society by the choices that they make when they're purchasing a cider or wine? Like, how do you convey the importance of where it was grown and how it was grown? I don't know. Like, what have you've done a fair bit of talking to the public, and I hope to at some point, but I'm just curious what you found works in terms of communicating.
It's. I think in order to be effective, um, you have to start with questions about um, where they're coming from, and try to see
Hmm.
what their experiences are, and what maybe their attitudes or prejudices are.
That sounds like a one to one kind of conversation, right? You
E-
kind of
yeah.
individual.
Or if I'm doing a talk.
Where do you start with your talks? Like, what's
Um,
your opening?
well, this year I've been starting with health, um, which I think is it doesn't have to be this year, the COVID year. It could be. it really is. It's the common denominator with anybody whose interests are art or science or money or whatever it is. I mean, everybody has health at as you know has a great interest in that. Um, it's if somebody's main motivation is money, then I'm especially challenged to try to get them to see the value of, of the wild apples or an uncultivated farm in which you're not maximizing the acreage. But it's challenging. I think one of the lessons I learned this year. This was was as this was the summer with protests and occurring around over the racial equality is everybody. It just seems like everybody knows everything and everybody's right and nobody's like the other person's always wrong. So it's hard to do a talk or a lecture because they're holding you as an expert on this. But to me, it in order to effectively connect, it does somehow have to be. You just have to listen, and then once you've found a bond, I don't know how, then you can sort of start translating the lessons that you've learned into that sort of that new common language, which if it could even be sports, but something that's disarming enough for somebody who possesses a contrary view, in this case of cultivation. So I don't know. Maybe just this is just happens to be what's on my mind recently. So that's the way I ended up answering that question. But I'm not good at going up in general at doing lectures or and just telling people like this is the way it is, because I've seen way too often that that things are different everywhere. That what was 100% true and absolute in one location isn't in another, and how do you account for that? So I'm just used to being surprised and wrong. So I don't have the confidence that I think it takes to be like an expert lecturer. But I do have my snaky way of bonding with people to at least the level where like we're both brothers who are all people, and now at least they can respect me on that level enough to hear my side of the story. I don't know.
And I think the first thing you said probably is a key to that, which is, listening. You said you mentioned just asking people questions and finding out where they're coming from. It sounds like listening is probably a big part of your ability to get to that point, I'm guessing.
Well, in art, that's I'm from a painting background. That listening is called seeing. You're rather than paint what you think you see, you just keep looking and looking and looking, and you can look back at the history of art and see people like Giacometti or Cezanne or Picasso who didn't go into a painting. Cezanne is a perfect example of this, with this expectation of like, this is what I'm trying to say. It was just by continuing to look while painting, he was flexible enough to keep noting the peculiarities that if one is truly seen, will be able to note and then explore. I don't know if do you know Giacometti's drawings?
No.
He's as famous as a sculptor, but his drawings are, I think, infinitely more interesting, and they come across looking like like the works of a neurotic. He's just constantly second guessing what he's seen. But in the end, I think it's that process makes his work feel so amazingly authentic. Anyway, so I think just the process of looking and just trying to stay open to what you're seeing is, that of course is what I call uncultivation, but is perfectly applicable or parallel to just relating to other people, cultivating relationships.
Yeah.
So I'm not an expert, in other words, unless we're all experts, and then in which case then I am. Yeah.
I like that. Well, I don't know how to end this other than to say thank you, and I want to. People can find your cidery at, is it Aaron Burr Cider? AaronBurrCidery.com?
I think it's Cider. I'm not very good with the .com thing, but I think it's Cider. It's Aaron Burr Cider. Yeah.
AaronBurrCider.com.
Yeah, the name of the company is Cidery, but the website is Cider, Aaron Burr Cider.
Do you ship to California?
We do. We don't ship in the hot summer, but we usually wait until the spring, or no, we wait until about mid-September when it's, because there's no.
That's still the hot summer out here.
Yeah.
It's probably our hottest part of our summer is September and October in LA. It's ridiculous. We'll have 3 weeks of 100 degrees easily.
Yeah, September. we don't recommend buying wine or cider by mail that way, but I know people do. We have a distributor in California who you probably know Ravel Wine. I don't know their LA rep, but
that sounds actually really familiar. I do know them.
Yeah.
I don't know if I know any reps either, but know the name.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So you have some in retail out here then?
Yeah, we do. And if
anything
I were
in Los Angeles that
I know there is some place in Los Angeles, because we have a friend who took a picture of our bottle and somewhere out there. So I know that it's there. I can't name. I don't know the city well enough to say where.
Okay. All right. I'll do a little searching. That's good to know. Anything else, Andy, you want to talk about?
No, I feel like that's probably. There's got to be at least 1 or 2 minutes of something in there that you could edit.
I'm gonna leave it uncut. It was pretty good, except my part. But
no, your bee thing is throwing. I'm gonna think about that for weeks now.
Man, me too. It's changed the way I think about things in the same way that your book has. It's really I can't recommend it enough for other people to read. It's a great read, and I think just in terms of resetting expectations, I think if that's a theme that we've been talking about, I think your book is really good at that. I think it digs into the pressures that are on artists and to the extent that you want your winemaking or cider making to be an art. It's an imperative read, because I think it's a very realistic look. I don't think it's as hopeless as you seem. Not that you seem hopeless, but you know what I mean. Like, but it's not. I think it's very realistic, but I think there's so much beauty and depth to it that it's hard not to come away inspired. I'll put it that way. So again, thanks for that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for this interview. It's been great talking to you.
Yeah, I've had a great time talking with you too. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. At some point in the podcast, I babbled on about another podcast that I listened to that gave me a lot of hope, and I wanted to share what that was with you since I couldn't remember it then. It is the Sustainable World Radio podcast, hosted by Jill Cloutier, who I think is based here in maybe Los Angeles. We might have to connect at some point. Her podcast is wonderful and a great resource to learn more about permaculture and just all things that promote a ecologically brighter future for the world. And this episode that I was speaking about to Andy was episode 151, in which she interviews Dr. John Todd, who is an ecological designer. He is the author of the book Healing Earth, An Ecologist's Journey of Innovation and Environmental Stewardship. And he does incredible work, and his motto, "Do good things in bad places," has now become this echoing refrain in the back of my head that I hope to live up to at this point.